Hello, this is Scotland's Missing Histories, episode number 2. And this time we need to talk about Màiri. Mhòr, Big Mary of the songs, Mary McPherson, so good that they gave her, well, quite a lot of names. This is a woman who lived through some very turbulent times in the north of Scotland and moved to Inverness and moved to Glasgow, spent time in prison and did something that we'd probably associate more with people like Beyoncé, even though it was 150 years ago. To find out more about Màiri, I spoke with Liz MacRae Shaw, who wrote a biography of her. So let's hear what Liz had to say, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Hi Liz, how's it going?
Fine, thank you.
It's good to finally get you onto the show, and this is our second episode. What we're going to talk about today is Màiri, or Mary of the Songs, or Mary of the Songs, or Mhòr, or there's a lot of names, but I have to confess that it's a name that I've only recently discovered. So you're something of an expert on this woman, so could you explain just to the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with this story?
Sure, I can. Although I sound very English, my mother was actually born and bred in Skye, and she married a sailor who was up here in Caerlabilloch in the mainland, and I was brought up in England and spent my childhood having two lives, really, one in the south of England, and then I came up and stayed with my grandparents every summer, and that was quite different. And I was fascinated by everything here. They're both native Gaelic speakers, and I love Gaelic songs, although at that time I couldn't understand the words. And my granny actually said that Mhòr was in her family tree, which contains a lot of McPhersons. But I don't think that's true. I think probably the relationship was with Isaac McPherson, who was Mhòr's husband. But it's still quite nice to think there's a link there. I then studied history at university, again down in England. And to my shame, really, knew very little about Scottish history. It was very, shall we say, Anglo-centric, and the Celtic neighbours only featured when they were causing trouble. So the Irish appeared quite a lot, the Scots and Welsh less so. And it was only much later that I realised about the potato famine affecting the Highlands and about the clearances and the whole story. And I became fascinated with Màiri, how she became a bard and a political campaigner when she got all the dice stacked against her. A woman from a poor crofting background, Gaelic-speaking Highlander, class background, gender, all sort of against her. And other sort of famous Victorian women like Florence Nightingale had got a moneyed background and education. And the more I found out about her, the more I was fascinated by this indomitable woman who refused to accept the constraints that society imposed on her.
I suppose that's the place to start, because I think from what I have read, the setting for where she was born and where she grew up is the central part of the story as well. There's this indomitable spirit, but also where the story of Màiri takes place is also a very important factor. So we should maybe start just at the beginning. Where was she born, and into what kind of conditions was she born?
Right. The interesting thing when I came to research her life, she was born in 1821 and died in 1898. So that's, there are good records for the 19th century, but there's really very little known about her, especially the first half of her life. Quite a lot of surviving oral memories. The only written source, really, was Professor Donald Meek's biography of her, which was written in Gaelic. And so my first job was to go to Mhòr up in Skye, the Gaelic College, and improve my skills. She was born in North Skye in Scabost in 1821. And even here, the exact date and place isn't certain. She was born into a crofting village, which has long since disappeared. And some people believe that she was actually born further north in the village of Uig. So it's not certain. She was born Màiri MacDonald. In her youth, as you said, she had lots of different names. In her youth, she would have been known as Màiri Ian Vane, fair Ian's daughter. On her marriage, she became Màiri McPherson, and she's usually known in the Highlands as Mhòr, or Mhòr and Òran, Great Mary of the Songs. It's said that her parents, like many other Gaels, decided to emigrate to Canada before her birth because of the poverty at home. Crofts too small and barren to give a decent living. But they didn't go. One version has it that they discovered that the owner of the emigrant ship was a cheat, and they ended up settling in Glasgow for some years, where some of their family were born, and then they returned to Skye, where Màiri herself and her brother were both born. And many of her songs that are still very much in the repertoire today are about the beauty of the natural world that surrounded her as a child on Skye.
Were the clearances underway? Had the worst of it been done, or
No,
when she was growing up? I mean, when she was
yeah.
young, was it still in full effect, or was it mostly
Well,
finished? Or
she was born just after the Napoleonic Wars when things had actually been better in the Highlands. And then it got worse afterwards, and most of the clearances were the 1840s, 1850s. But they continued after that. But that was the sort of height of it, really,
so,
about 1840 to 1860.
so she would have seen all of this happening.
Yes, she would. Yes, she would indeed have seen that happening. And of course, the potato famine in 1847, which affected the Highlands very, very badly and made the clearances worse.
And there's an interesting fact there, because when most people hear about the potato famine, they tend to associate it only with Ireland, but you're saying that there was also large deprivation caused by this in Scotland as well.
There was. It wasn't as disastrous as in Ireland, because in Ireland, I think there were absentee landlords and they didn't get food aid to people quickly enough, or they didn't try hard enough. Here, there's already all the links with the steamer routes, and the landlords, although reluctantly, many of them, did actually stop people starving. So there wasn't quite the same dreadful level of people dying, although a lot of people were forced or encouraged to leave. And obviously it was a much smaller population, but the effects were much the same. Several years running of the potatoes growing seemed to be okay, and then turning to mush and people having nothing to live on.
And so, as you said, many people emigrated to Canada and various other places, but a lot of people also went down to Glasgow. There was a large Gaelic community in Glasgow. And is it the case that Màiri, after seeing all of these things, went directly to Glasgow, or did she go somewhere else first?
No, she spent most of her earlier life in Inverness, which is unusual. I don't know why, because I mean the links were with Glasgow, as you rightly say. But she actually moved to Inverness to look for work sometime in the 1840s. And that's when she married Isaac Macpherson, who his family also came from Skye, and at that time was a shoemaker by trade. And they lived in the Maggot area of Inverness, close to the river, and raised a family. And one of the few records really of her before she became middle-aged was the 1861 census, and she was living then with 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, her husband, and her mother-in-law, who was aged 99, and another daughter died in childhood. But that's the only record of her at that time. I mean, like most working-class people, women especially, there was nothing exceptional about her. She didn't appear in the records. Then all the troubles hit her. In 1871, her husband Isaac died, probably of meningitis. At the time of his death, he was working as a chimney sweep, no longer a shoemaker. And there's a story that he had been working in a shoe factory, which was owned by Bally Simpson in Inverness. And that when Isaac led the workers in demanding higher wages, he was sacked and so changed jobs. Màiri had to then support herself and her family, and she found work as a private nurse, caring for Harriet Turner, who was the wife of a Captain Henry Turner, an officer in the Royal Engineers. This poor woman had got typhoid, and it was probably a job that no one wanted to nurse her, and she died at the age of 32. And then, if that's okay, I'll read a short report that appeared in the Inverness Courier of the event which really led to Màiri becoming famous. A very painful and disgraceful case came before Bally Simpson at the police court on Monday. A nurse named Mary MacDonald, or Macpherson, was engaged to attend a lady lying ill of fever. The lady, comparatively a stranger in Inverness and living with her family in lodgings, unhappily died, and the nurse took advantage of her position to pillage her wardrobe. While the funeral service was being read at the cathedral, she was ransacking the boxes of her deceased mistress. The charge was fully proved and the prisoner sentenced to 40 days imprisonment. So this is Màiri at the age of 50.
Accused of stealing.
Theft.
Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And she probably had some English, but she was a Gaelic speaker and she couldn't understand the court proceedings. She always protested her innocence. And although we can't be certain, her reaction to her sentence suggests that she was innocent. Oral tradition has it that a young servant girl who was working in the same household disliked Màiri because Màiri was always telling her off for her slovenly ways, and that she took revenge by putting some of the woman's clothing into Màiri's belongings to incriminate her. But whatever the truth of it, it was this event that sort of unleashed Màiri's poetic voice, and she poured out her rage and humiliation into songs that linked her personal distress with the despair of her fellow Highlanders who were being evicted.
Where did she serve the sentence?
She served it in Inverness, and after that she left the city, not surprisingly, and moved to Glasgow. But interestingly enough, she asked to be buried in Inverness because her husband was buried there. But other than that, she shook the dust of Inverness off her heels.
So then you said, so this led to this creative outburst from Màiri. And how did it begin? What was the first sort of signs of this?
Well, one of the first songs was The Speakers of English, Luchtna Burla, in which she, if I just quote you a verse or two, it's not the same translated, but it gives an idea. I'm weary of the speakers of English. I long for some warmth and music. I'm truly tired of the speakers of English. I dreamt I saw soldiers closing in around me in my nightmare, Captain Turner and the ladies. I jumped up in terror. They gave me stone slabs to walk on, a board for a pillow. A clear conscience helped me then, protected me, kept out all harm. It was good that I felt no guilt. My conscience wasn't choking me. That was what kept me going when I was in my deep despair. Our land is defiled by sheep coming up from the south like a plague. There's not a creature that moves, not tormented and torn apart. Now people are driven over the ocean by hard-hearted men, no cattle to be heard in the pasture, no herdsman to call them home. Where the people live, now sheep, a shepherd on every hill, and barking dogs on the moor.
Did she begin performing these in public, or where was the stage for these songs that she was beginning to produce?
Well, she had a stroke of luck at this awful point in that John Murdoch, who was one of the leaders of what became the Highland Lad League, took up her cause and helped her to get to Glasgow and to train as a nurse and midwife there. And so she spent quite a number of years then working in the city and also talking and singing at rallies.
I read something about the singing at rallies. She had begun to build up an audience, so she would go on stage before politicians, and therefore politicians had an audience. I read something to that effect.
That's right. I mean, she was definitely the warm-up act. She was the kind of yeast, that raised the doughy speeches. And because the Land League leaders were middle-class men, she could speak to people. Highlanders who'd had to come down to Glasgow, their families there. She was one of them. So, and she had a real way with her, apparently, and she got away with hecklers. I don't know if you've heard the story about the famous heckling episode or not.
Please tell.
Well, Glasgow audiences are sort of known to be quite tough, aren't they? I think it's fair to say. Mm-hmm. One time, a man called out in the audience. She was singing the praises of Skye, and he called out, "Well, what use is Skye to anyone? There's nothing there but rocks, and all you eat are tatties." And quick as a flash, she turned her back on the audience. And she was a big, tall woman, 17 stone at least. And she slapped her bottom and shouted, "That's how well they feed us on Skye." And then, of course, she got the audience roaring with laughter. But there's a racier version. And Mhòr Henriksen, who was a famous singer of Màiri songs and lives on Skye, her father was from Harris. And he heard the story that Màiri actually raised her skirts and mooned and said, "These are the bannocks that the Isle of Skye gave me." But whichever story, she had the gift of winning people over.
Wonderful. But sorry, you just mentioned the Land League. Could you explain a bit more what the Land League was?
Yes, it wasn't called that at first. It was a group of men, really, mainly men, who campaigned to try and undo the effects of the clearances. One of the problems was that crofters had no security of tenure. They often had very poor quality land. And even when the clearances were over, landlords were kept putting the rents up and forcing them out, and they got no recourse against this, really. So John Murdoch actually had a paper called The Highlander, which lasted for quite a number of years. And Alexander Mackenzie, who was based in Inverness, wrote a famous book